Look at her! My mother laughed, her champagne flute trembling with her mockery. Kenia was so obsessed with her failure that she even tattooed a target on her skin. She's literally a bullseye for the M230 cannons our own company builds. Beside her, Dixon, the SEAL commander, suddenly turned deathly pale. He grabbed her wrist, his eyes fixed on the glowing pulse beneath my skin. "Belinda, stop," he whispered, his voice a terrified rasp that cut through the music. "That marking is classified. It's Raven 0. You have no idea what you just did." My mother's knees buckled. She fainted before she could even grasp that the daughter she had spent years erasing was the only one holding the trigger to her empire. The memory of her collapse still flickers behind my eyes like a glitching screen, sharp and hollow, until the biting wind of the present finally pulls me back to the window. The evening light over the Potomac River always had a way of looking like bruised silk, violet, heavy, and cold. From the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the Arlington mansion, the water seemed to stand still, mimicking the suffocating silence of the hallways behind me. I moved through the foyer, my footsteps swallowed by the thick Persian rugs, checking the placement of white lilies for tonight's gala. To the world outside, this house was a fortress of defense contracts and old money prestige. To me, it was a hollow shell where I existed only as a lingering shadow. I adjusted a silver platter, my reflections staring back at me from the polished surface. I didn't look like a thorn. I looked like a woman who had seen the sun set over the desert too many times, my skin weathered by winds my family had never bothered to imagine. I checked the digital guest list on the tablet in my hand, my fingers moving with a precision that was purely mechanical. None of these people were coming to see me. In fact, if I stood in the middle of the ballroom tonight, most would simply hand me their empty champagne flutes without ever meeting my eyes. Wealth isn't found in the glass and steel that surrounds us. It isn't found in the way a name carries weight in a boardroom. True wealth is the peace we keep within ourselves when the world tries to strip us of our skin. I took a deep breath, the scent of expensive floor wax and lilies filling my lungs. I paused by the mahogany side table, my eyes landing on the silver-framed photograph of my father. His eyes were the only ones in this house that ever looked at me with anything other than calculation. I reached out, my thumb grazing the glass to clear a speck of dust. It was a small gesture, a quiet bridge to a love that felt ancient and fragile. Even if this house no longer had a place for my heart, I still held on to the memories of the man who taught me that honor wasn't a badge you wore, but a promise you kept. My moment of stillness was shattered by the rhythmic, aggressive strike of heels on marble. The sound preceded her like a warning siren, turning the air from quiet to hostile in an instant. Belinda Thorne didn't enter a room. She laid claim to it. She stood in the doorway of the library, her silhouette sharp against the twilight. She didn't offer a greeting or a glance of maternal warmth. Instead, she gestured with a sharp flick of her wrist toward the mahogany desk inside. I followed her, my back straight, my internal rhythm falling into the steady beat of a soldier waiting for the brief. "Sit down, Kenia," she commanded, her voice like the snap of a winter branch. I didn't sit. I stood before the desk, meeting her gaze with a level of calm that I knew irritated her. She hated things she couldn't control, and she had never quite figured out how to control the silence I had brought back from the war. With a clinical, surgical precision, she slid a manila folder across the dark wood. Her nails, a perfect shade of deep burgundy, tapped against the paper with a sound like a heartbeat. I looked down. Through the clear plastic window of the folder, the words jumped out at me in stark, federal black. Department of Defense, Certificate of Death. The name below the header was mine. Kenia Thorne. It cited the Samurand incident from 5 years ago. It had the official seals, the signatures of the Adjutant General, and the finality of a closed casket. My heart didn't skip a beat. It didn't need to. I had felt dead the moment the first mortar hit our camp, but seeing it on government letterhead made the betrayal feel like a physical weight in the room. "You died a hero 5 years ago," Belinda said, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the evening's menu. "The military life insurance, The SGLI and the corporate death benefits from Thorn Defense were settled long ago. You were a killed-in-action hero. It was the only useful thing you ever did for this family's bottom line. I ran my fingertips over the edge of the folder. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A piece of paper cannot kill a soul, but it can certainly steal a name. I looked at the woman who had given me life and realized she was the one most eager to see me buried. She explained that according to every federal database, the woman standing in front of her didn't exist. If I tried to claim my identity now, if I walked out that door and told the truth, I would be prosecuted for multi-million-dollar insurance fraud and desertion. Sometimes the people who bring you into this world are the ones who find your existence the most inconvenient. She was telling me I was a legal ghost. A shadow with no bank account, no social security number, and no right to breathe the air in my own home unless I played the part of the invisible servant. I stood tall against the silhouette of the woman I used to call Mother, the flickering light from the fireplace casting long, jagged shadows across the library walls. The injustice of it was a cold fire in my veins. I had bled for a country that had been told I was already rotting in the ground so that my mother could buy more marble for her foyer. I accept it, I said, my voice cutting through her lecture with a terrifyingly calm grace. Belinda paused, her eyes narrowing. You accept what? The death of the name Kenia Thorne, I replied. If being dead means I no longer have to be associated with the rot of this family's legacy, then I'll take the bargain. You think you've trapped me with a death certificate, Mother. But you've only given me the one thing I couldn't buy for myself. A clean break from you. I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, a momentary fracture in her cold mask. I stayed in this house tonight not because I feared her paper threats, but because I still harbored a foolish, dying hope that I might find a shred of the mother I remembered before the greed became her heartbeat. I knew then that the woman was gone. There was only the CEO left. I turned to leave, but as I walked toward the door, my eyes caught the serial number on the federal folder. I didn't need to write it down. I had spent years memorizing coordinates under fire. A 10-digit string of numbers was child's play. I was already calculating the nodes, the access points, and the legal shadows Belinda had tried to use as my cage. She thought she had buried me, but she had forgotten that I was trained to operate in the dark. I walked out of the library and headed toward the kitchen to begin my duties for the gala. I carried the weight of being legally dead, but I walked with the posture of a queen who knew exactly where the crowns were hidden. The air in the industrial kitchen was thick with the scent of seared scallops and expensive butter, a heavy, cloying perfume that did nothing to mask the metallic tang of dread in my throat. Waiters moved in a frantic, choreographed dance around me, their movements sharp and hurried as the gala reached its peak. I stood at the stainless steel prep station, my hands steady as I scanned the digital seating chart on the tablet. Every name was a reminder of the world I had been forcibly removed from. Then my eyes caught a name that made the room turn cold. Sitting at the VVIP table, right at my mother's elbow, was the CEO of Vanguard Systems. I stared at the corporate logo on the security details lapels through the kitchen window. It was the same emblem I had seen on the faulty firing pins and the jammed muzzles back at Samarand. My father once told me that a man is not defined by the height of his throne, but by the depth of the shadow he casts over others. Looking at that name, I saw a shadow that had swallowed my friends whole. Belinda wasn't just hosting a dinner. She was celebrating a blood-stained merger with the man who had signed my team's death warrant. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone who profited from your greatest pain? It's a moment that tests every ounce of your character. I didn't reach for the spices to ruin the appetizers. I didn't let my anger dictate my hands. Instead, I meticulously plated each hors d'oeuvre with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. A true professional never allows an enemy's lack of ethics to diminish her own excellence. If I was going to serve them, I would do it with a perfection that made me indistinguishable from the background noise of their success. That was where my power lay for now, in being the perfect silent observer. The swinging doors burst open, and the frantic hum of the kitchen was sliced through by Mylise's sharp, mocking laughter. She didn't look like a sister. She looked like a predator who had found a new way to pull the wings off a fly. She walked toward me, her silk dress rustling with a sound like dry leaves, and tossed a bundle of fabric onto the prep table. It hit the steel with a soft, hollow thud. "Change into this, Kenia," she said, her voice dripping with a poisonous sweetness. Mother decided the standard server's vest was too ordinary for our guest of honor. Since you love being a failed soldier so much, you should wear your failure for everyone to see. I reached out and unfurled the garment. My heart didn't just drop, it froze. It was a server's tunic, but it had been custom made from the desecrated remains of my actual desert camo combat uniform. The fabric was still stiff, the edges frayed where she had ordered it cut. I ran my fingertips over the cloth and felt the faint, microscopic grit of sand that never truly washes out. Miley saw a costume of shame, a way to remind the guests that the Thorne family's youngest was a broken remnant. But as I touched the fabric, I felt the presence of my fallen brothers in arms. Those who mock the scars of others only reveal they have never been brave enough to earn their own. "It suits you," Milas hissed, leaning in close so only I could hear. "A reminder of exactly where you belong, beneath the feet of people who actually matter." I didn't give her the satisfaction of a flinch or an argument. I took the uniform and moved to the small changing stall in the back. I stepped into the fabric that had once been my skin during the longest nights of my life. It was a heavy, bitter burden, but I wore it with a posture that Miles would never understand. I wasn't being humiliated. I was being reminded of why I was still standing. I adjusted the collar, the rough material grazing my neck, and walked back out into the light. The transition corridor to the ballroom was a blur of gold-leafed mirrors and white marble. I took a deep breath, centering my pulse. I wasn't Kenia the servant. I was Kenia the operative, moving into a hostile environment. I pushed through the double doors, the sudden roar of laughter and the clinking of crystal hitting me like a physical wave. I moved toward the VVIP table, the camera of my mind recording every face, every whispered secret, every boastful laugh. I reached the CEO's table. He was mid-sentence, gesturing with a cigar as he discussed efficiency quotas and operational overhead. He looked up at me as I leaned in to pour his vintage Cabernet. He paused, his eyes traveling over the camo patterns of my tunic, and he let out a short, barking laugh. "Thematic touch, Belinda," he said, nodding toward me as if I were a piece of furniture. "Bringing a bit of the front line to the Arlington hills. It's gritty. I like it." I kept my eye contact steady, my hand as still as stone as the dark wine filled his glass. He had no idea that I knew the serial number of every faulty component his company had shipped. He spoke about the unfortunate losses at Samarand as mere statistics, a necessary dip in the quarterly earnings. I didn't spill a drop. I didn't let the bottle shake. I looked at him with the calm of a deep ocean, terrifying in its stillness. Beside me, a young waiter tripped, his tray wobbling under the weight of the heavy crystal. Before he could fall, I reached out a hand, subtly bracing his elbow and steadying the tray without a word. I chose to be a source of light for him, even while I stood in my own personal hell. Looking at the CEO's smug face, I realized that some people are so poor, all they have is money. He thought he was the architect of his own empire, but he was just a man building a house on a foundation of sand and stolen lives. I pulled back, the wine service complete, and faded back into the shadows of the pillars. I was pouring wine for the man who signed my team's death warrant, but I knew something he didn't. Soon, I wouldn't be serving him a drink. I would be serving him a reckoning. The grand ballroom felt like a glass cage under the harsh, modern brilliance of the UV-accented chandeliers. I moved with a practiced, feline grace, my senses hyper-alert as I navigated the head table. Every clink of silverware against fine china sounded like the cocking of a weapon in the sudden hush of the elite. I could feel a tactical gaze burning into me, analyzing the way I held my shoulders and the economy of my movements. It was Dixon. The SEAL commander sat beside my mother, his eyes narrowing as if trying to piece together a map of a territory he once knew. As I leaned in to refresh the sparkling water, Dixon purposefully nudged his military challenge coin off the table's edge. It hit the floor with a heavy, metallic ring that seemed to vibrate through my boots. I didn't hesitate. I sank into a controlled crouch, retrieved the bronze disc, and handed it back to him. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and I pressed my thumb against the coin's face in a specific professional grip, a silent veteran's nod that only a brother in arms would recognize. True nobility isn't found in an inherited title or a seat at a high-stakes table. It's found in how you carry yourself when you have absolutely nothing left to prove to the world. Have you ever noticed how the most powerful people in a room are often the ones who say the least? While Belinda and her guests played their games of status, I watched a frail, elderly veteran at the neighboring table struggling to adjust his heavy coat over a prosthetic arm. No one else noticed him. I moved away from the VVIP circle and offered a quiet, respectful assist, tucking the fabric exactly where it needed to be. His whispered, "Thank you, Kenia," was the first time my name had sounded like music in this house for years. It was a small moment of humanity, a reminder that even in a den of wolves, one can still choose to be a protector. The atmosphere shifted from stiff formality to sharp, jagged cruelty when Milas sensed the shift in the air. She had seen the way Dixon's eyes followed me, and for a woman like her, attention was a zero-sum game. As I turned back toward the main service station, she extended her foot with a calculated, surgical precision. I felt the snag on my hem and the sudden drench of cold, red wine splashing across my chest, and the pristine white silk rug beneath us. The sound of her sharp, mocking laughter cut through the music like a blade. "Kenia, look at the mess you've made!" she cried out, her voice projecting to ensure every dignitary in the room was watching. "Get on your knees and clean this up. Since you failed so miserably as a soldier, perhaps you can at least manage the basic duties of a maid." The ballroom went deathly quiet, 100 pairs of eyes fixed on me, waiting for a breakdown, a scream or a plea. I didn't give them any of it. I slowly lowered myself to the floor, the damp silk of the rug pressing against my knees. I didn't feel humiliated. I felt a profound, unbreakable inner peace. I knew that the floor was just a cold, temporary surface, while my dignity was a fortress they simply weren't equipped to breach. A diamond doesn't lose its value just because it's covered in mud. It simply waits for the right moment to catch the light. I took a white linen handkerchief from my belt and began blotting the stain, my movements steady and calm. A slow 360-degree pan of the camera around the room would reveal my family's mocking smiles, contrasting with the growing discomfort on Dixon's face. He fidgeted in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He saw what they were doing. He saw a soul being dragged down into the mud by the very people who should have been its support. As I cleaned, I kept my head low, my ears tuned to the frequency of the conversation above me. Belinda was leaning toward a contractor, her voice a low murmur that she thought was hidden by the ambient noise. They were discussing a missing shipment of M230 firing pins, a legal admission of the fraud that had caused the ambush at Samarand. I memorized every word, every hesitation, every smug chuckle. A young server, barely 20, moved toward me with a fresh bowl of water, his eyes full of pity. Milas hissed at him to stay back, her face contorting with a petty, childish malice. "Don't touch her," Milas snapped. "She needs to learn her place." I reached out and gave the young man's hand a reassuring squeeze, taking the heat of Milas's gaze upon myself to protect him. Dixon finally spoke up, his voice a low rumble that commanded instant attention. "Is this really necessary, Belinda? She's clearly a professional." My mother simply waved a dismissive hand, her smile never reaching her eyes. "It's just family discipline, Dixon. Some children require a firmer hand to understand their limitations." I stood up from the floor, my hem stained with wine and my knees bruised from the marble, but my eyes remained as calm as a deep ocean. I looked at Belinda, then at Milas, and finally at the CEO who thought he had won. They were so busy laughing at the mess on the silk rug that they had completely forgotten who was actually holding the keys to the room. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, charged with the static electricity of a coming storm that they were too arrogant to see. The silence in the ballroom didn't just fall, It solidified, turning the air into something thick and unbreathable. I remained on my knees for a second longer than necessary, letting the cold silk of the wine-soaked rug anchor me. Above, the high-intensity UV blue decorative lights hummed with a low, electric frequency that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. I felt Mylise's presence before I saw her move, a whirlwind of expensive perfume and fermented malice. Her hand lashed out, the crack of the slap echoing against the glass walls like a gunshot. The force of the blow sent me sprawling onto the marble, my cheek stinging with a heat that felt far more honest than anything else in this room. But Mylise wasn't finished. She lunged forward with a desperate, frantic energy, her fingers clawing at the tactical bandage I had wrapped around my left forearm. With one violent tug, the fabric hissed away, exposing the skin she had spent years trying to hide from the light. In that instant, the ballroom's specialized lighting reacted. The ink wasn't ink at all. It was a subdermal biometric interface, a web of light-reactive polymers embedded beneath the skin. Under the UV rays, it ignited into a luminescent military green, pulsating with a rhythmic, digital heartbeat. A complex 3D targeting reticle of an AH-64 Apache's M230 chain gun materialized on my skin, shimmering with a life of its own. I didn't cry out. I didn't even flinch. I lay there with a terrifying stillness, watching the light dance on the floor. People who try to extinguish your light usually end up setting fire to their own house. Even as my head throbbed from the strike, my mind remained in tactical overdrive. I noticed the mansion's smart system security panels near the doors beginning to glitch, their red LEDs flickering as my interface automatically synced with the room's high-frequency electronics. The guests stood frozen, their faces distorted by the eerie green glow reflecting off their champagne glasses. My first instinct wasn't revenge. It was an ingrained soldier's concern for the safety of the perimeter. I was a weapon that had been activated in a room full of children playing with matches. Belinda stepped forward, her heels clicking rhythmically like a countdown. She stood over me, silhouetted against the emerald light, and for the first time in my life, her laughter sounded hollow, a desperate sound trying to mask the onset of a storm. She gestured toward my arm with a mocking flourish, her voice projecting to the very back of the hall. "Look at her!" Belinda cried out, her eyes bright with a cruel, manic triumph. Kenia was so desperate to be a hero, so hungry for a war that didn't want her, that she turned herself into a target. "You aren't a warrior, Kenia. You're just a bullseye for the very weapons I build in my factories. You've X-rayed your own failure for everyone to see." I stood up slowly, the movement fluid and devoid of the servant's hesitation I had worn all night. I wiped a thin trail of blood from my lip with the back of my hand, my posture as straight as a bayonet. I looked at her, and the pity I felt was a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. A mother's job is supposed to be protecting her child from the world's sharp edges. But Belinda had spent her life protecting the world from the truth of what her child actually was. The elite crowd leaned in, their expressions a mix of horrified fascination and indignant frustration. I could see the older veterans in the back, men who had spent their lives in service, looking at Belinda with a growing, silent disgust. They knew that mocking a soldier's sacrifice was the ultimate confession of a small, cowardly soul. Belinda continued her monologue, her words dripping with a condescension that had worked for decades. But tonight, the air felt different. It felt like the moment right before a dam bursts. Suddenly, the circle of guests fractured. Dixon pushed his way through the crowd, his face a mask of pale, stunned disbelief. The camera of my mind caught every detail. The way his pupils dilated, the way his hand hovered over his sidearm by instinct. He didn't look at Belinda. He didn't look at the CEO. He sank to one knee in front of me, his breathing shallow and jagged, as he stared at the glowing biometric on my arm. "Belinda, shut up," Dixon whispered, his voice a raspy, terrifying sound that cut through her laughter like a guillotine. My mother froze, her mouth half open. "Dixon, it's just a decorative marking, a sign of her. This isn't a target," Dixon interrupted, his voice rising with a cold, authoritative fury. "This is Raven 0. This is the high-altitude firing clearance for the entire Western Hemisphere Apache fleet. You didn't just mock a servant, Belinda. You just insulted the highest-ranking combat controller in the Pentagon's Black Ops history. You just slapped the woman who has the legal authority to ground your entire company with a single pulse. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an empire beginning to crack. I looked at Belinda, and for the first time I saw the woman behind the CEO mask, small, terrified, and utterly out of her depth. Her face drained of color, turning a sickly, translucent white under the green glow of my skin. She realized then that the legal and military weight of what she had exposed was a tidal wave she couldn't swim away from. "I didn't choose to be a target, Mother," I said, my voice as sharp and steady as a surgical blade. "I chose to be the one who decides what in this world is actually worth saving. And right now, looking at you, I'm finding very few reasons to hold back the strike." Belinda's knees didn't just shake, they buckled. She fell forward like a hollow statue, her hand grasping uselessly at the air before she fainted into the arms of the Vanguard CEO. The ballroom erupted into a hushed, panicked chaos, guests backing away as if I were a live wire. I stood at the center of the wreckage, my arm pulsating with a rhythmic green light that looked like a countdown to a new dawn. My name had been Emma once to them, a ghost to be mocked, but tonight, they learned the name that the shadows feared. The echo of the ballroom doors slamming shut behind me felt like the strike of a gavel. The transition from the warm golden light of the gala to the stark, clinical silence of the transition corridor was instantaneous. I was flanked by 4 men in tactical gear, their faces hidden behind visors, the Vanguard Systems logo on their shoulders mocking my very existence. My mother had recovered from her faint with a speed that was nothing short of predatory. Within minutes, the narrative had been rewritten. The announcement over the house comms was smooth and professional. Kenia had suffered a severe mental break, a tragic byproduct of her combat trauma, and was being moved to a safe area for her own protection. Dixon had tried to intervene, his voice echoing in the foyer, but I watched through the narrowing gap of the library doors as Belinda's lawyers swarmed him. They cited corporate jurisdiction and private medical emergency protocols that tied his hands in knots of legal red tape. I was alone now, forced into the soundproofed private library, a room built for high-stakes defense negotiations where secrets went to die. I walked past the shelves of leather-bound books, my breathing rhythmic and steady. The most dangerous weapon Belinda Thorne ever built wasn't a cannon or a missile. It was a lie told with enough conviction to sound like the truth. As the heavy steel-reinforced doors hissed shut, locking with a series of digital clicks, one of the younger guards hesitated. His hand lingered on the latch, and I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He knew who I was. He knew the weight of the Raven Zero mark. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he whispered, so low the others couldn't hear. I looked at him and gave a slight, tired nod. "Don't apologize for doing your job, son," I said softly. "I don't blame the tool for the master's intent. Even in this cage, I refuse to let their cruelty strip me of my grace." I knew he was just a man following orders, caught in a machine larger than any of us. The room remained dim until a wall monitor hummed to life, bathing the library in a cold, flickering blue light. Miley's was on the screen, her face twisted into a mask of triumph. She wasn't just there to watch me, she was there to bury me. She began to play a video, a grainy, high-definition reel that looked like surveillance footage from the family's high-security vault. In the video, a woman who looked exactly like me was seen bypassing encryption and copying sensitive biometric targeting data into a private drive. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. They had taken my heroism and meticulously doctored it into a crime of treason. The blue light reflected in Miley's eyes as she leaned into the camera. "The evidence is perfect, Kenia," she hissed. "By tomorrow morning, the Pentagon will have this. They won't see a hero. They'll see a thief selling classified software to foreign interests. You didn't just die at Samarand. You became a traitor who staged her own death to facilitate an exit strategy." Belinda stepped into the frame beside her sister, her voice flat and devoid of any maternal warmth. She laid out the ultimatum with the coldness of a judge. I was to sign a full confession, admitting to the theft and agreeing to return to the dead status of the Samarand report, or I would be handed over to a military tribunal. She referenced the Espionage Act, citing federal penalties that would see me buried in a black site prison for the rest of my natural life. The threat was grounded, terrifying, and legally airtight. I stayed silent, my eyes tracing the minute glitches in the doctored footage that only a specialist would recognize. A lion doesn't need to roar when it knows the hunter's gun is empty. They left me then, the monitor cutting to black and the lights dimming to a faint red emergency glow. I was stripped of my phone, my tactical gear, and my identity. I sat in the darkness, the only light in the room coming from the luminescent green pulse of the biometric interface on my arm. It felt like a heartbeat against my skin. I closed my eyes and let the silence fill me, reaching back into the memories of my father. He used to tell me that when the world puts you in the dark, you don't waste time looking for a light. You become the light. I stood up and walked toward the smart glass door. Belinda and Milas thought they had caged a bird, but they had actually locked themselves in a room with a hawk that knew every weakness in the walls. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they forgot a basic rule of engineering. Every cage has a circuit, and every circuit has a node. I looked at the security keypad beside the door. They had locked me in the library because it was the most secure room in the house, but that also meant it was the room with the most direct connection to the mansion's internal server nodes. I raised my arm, the biometric glow intensifying as I focused my intent. I pressed the Raven 0 mark against the glass of the smart door's interface. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, the entire house's power grid groaned. The red lights flickered, the hum of the HVAC system stalled, and the digital locks throughout the mansion chirped in a frantic, uncoordinated chorus. My interface wasn't just a targeting tool, it was a master key to the very infrastructure Vanguard systems had helped build. I wasn't trapped. I was finally in the driver's seat. Have you ever wondered why those who seek to control others are always the most afraid of being controlled? It's because they know exactly how fragile their power truly is. I felt the pulse of the mansion's server in my fingertips, a river of data waiting to be redirected. I had been a shadow for 5 years, and I had learned that the best way to win a war isn't to fight the enemy's strength, but to simply unplug their reality. I sat back down in the dark, my gaze fixed on the door, waiting for the first crack to appear in their perfect empire. The red emergency lighting in the library pulsed like a dying heart, but beneath the skin of my left arm, a different light was waking up. I stood before the smart glass terminal, the bioluminescent green of my biometric interface casting long, serrated shadows against the rows of leather-bound books. Belinda had locked this room with the confidence of a woman who owned the world, never suspecting that the Raven 0 clearance embedded in my marrow was designed to bypass even the most sophisticated civilian fortifications. I pressed my forearm against the glass sensor. A low, harmonic hum vibrated through the floorboards as the mansion's digital pulse surrendered to my touch. Justice isn't a hammer meant to shatter lives in a fit of rage. It is a mirror meant to show people exactly who they are when the lights finally go out. As the firewalls dissolved into lines of cascading green code, I navigated the corporate architecture of Thorn Defense with a surgical precision that Belinda would never have credited to her invisible daughter. She thought I was just a tech, a pair of hands to turn a wrench, but I had spent my 7 months of exile studying every bolt, every line of proprietary code, and every back door in her empire. I wasn't just breaking into a system, I was reclaiming a territory that had been built on my silence. Before I began the final harvest of data, I paused. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, the green glow of the screen illuminating the deep fatigue in my eyes. I navigated to the payroll and personal files of the household staff, the young waiters, the aging cooks, and the security guards who were just trying to put their children through college. With a few swift commands, I encrypted their private data and moved their pension allocations into offshore escrow accounts. If the Thorn Empire was going to fall tonight, I was going to make sure the innocent didn't get buried in the rubble. It was a quiet act of kindness in a room full of ghosts. The deep sector files finally groaned open, revealing the Black Ledger, a series of encrypted audio logs and wire transfer receipts hidden behind a triple-layer military shroud. I clicked the first file. The grainy, distorted voice of my mother filled the silent library, discussing the GPS coordinates of my unit with a representative from Obsidian hand. She had sold our position for a contract extension. She had traded my friends' lives for a seat on a new board of directors. The shock of it hit me like a physical blow, a heart-wrenching confirmation that the woman who gave me life had actively sought to end it for a profit margin. The heavy library doors burst open with a crash of splintering wood. Miley stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the harsh white light of the hallway. She was breathing heavily, a security baton gripped in her hand, her face a mask of desperation and raw, unadulterated cruelty. "Get away from that terminal, Kenia!" she screamed, lunging across the room with a frantic, uncoordinated energy. I didn't panic. I didn't even raise my voice. As she swung the baton, I moved with the fluid, non-lethal grace of my training, catching her wrist and pivoting my weight. I held her in a firm, immobilizing grip, her face pressed against the cold mahogany of the desk. She struggled, her muffled curses filling the air, but I held her with a stillness that was more terrifying than any violence. "Look at the screen, Miley's," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "Look at what she did." I played the recording again. As Belinda's voice discussed the operational overhead of our deaths, I felt Miley's go limp in my arms. The heaviest burden the person can ever carry isn't the weight of a secret, but the cost of the blood spilled to keep it hidden from the light. I released her and turned back to the terminal, my fingers flying across the keys as I cloned the data onto a secure federal cloud. I referenced the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the specific anti-corruption statutes that Belinda had violated, building a legal cage that no lawyer in D.C. could talk her out of. Miley slumped onto the floor, her expensive silk dress pooling around her like a shroud. She looked up at me, her eyes red and hollow. "You're going to destroy everything," she whispered. "The Thorn name will be nothing." I didn't look at her as I executed the final command. I initiated a Trojan transfer, a protocol I had designed months ago. I wasn't stealing the Thorn liquidity. I was redirecting it. Every cent of the blood money Belinda had accumulated from the Samaran deal was being moved into irrevocable trust funds for the widows and orphans of the men she had sacrificed. I explained this to Milis as the progress bar ticked toward completion. True wealth isn't what you collect in a vault. It's what you are willing to let go of to ensure that the scales of the world are finally made even. The mansion's alarm system began to wail, a high-pitched, frantic sound that echoed through the vents. The power grid flickered as the massive transfer of assets triggered red flags in every banking hub from Zurich to New York. Milis sat in the corner, sobbing quietly, her world dissolving into zeros and ones. I simply sat back in the leather chair, my hands folded in my lap, watching the numbers on the screen drop to zero. The weight of 5 years of silence was finally lifting, replaced by a profound, righteous clarity. I looked out the library window toward the Potomac. The first rhythmic thumping of rotors was beginning to echo over the water, the searchlights of the coming storm sweeping across the darkened Arlington horizon. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was just a soldier who had completed her mission and was now waiting for the dawn. The real power was arriving, and for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly who was going to be left standing when the dust settled. The roar of the Blackhawks over the Potomac was a sound I had heard 1,000 times in the desert, but tonight, it felt like a choir of reckoning. The glass walls of the mansion vibrated with the sheer force of the rotors, and the searchlights sliced through the library like divine scalpels, exposing every lie hidden in the shadows of the mahogany shelves. Belinda was screaming for her private security, her voice a shrill, desperate thing that was swallowed by the thunder from the sky. I stood at the window, the biometric glow on my arm pulsing in rhythm with the approaching storm. The mansion's private security team, men trained to protect corporate secrets at any cost, didn't even draw their weapons. As the helicopters hovered over the helipad, The lead pilots broadcast the midnight protocol override on every local frequency. They saw the federal insignia, they saw the black-clad tactical teams fast roping onto the lawn, and they stood down. They knew that when the Raven speaks, the world listens. Dixon stepped through the library door, not as a guest, but as a commander. He led a federal tactical team with a grim, purposeful stride, moving directly to my side. I didn't need to be rescued. I needed a witness. I handed the encrypted drive, the one containing the black ledger of Samarand, to the lead federal agent, a man whose face was as hard as the law he represented. I watched Belinda in the foyer, watching her world dissolve into a sea of flashing blue lights and tactical gear. She tried to maintain her composure, smoothing her silk dress with trembling hands, but the marble beneath her feet was no longer solid. A house built on the bones of others can never truly be a home, no matter how much stone you use to hide the truth. As the agents moved to secure Belinda and Miley's, I stepped forward. I saw the rough grip they were using on my mother's arms and felt a strange, detached sorrow. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice carrying over the fading rotor wash, "please, do this with professional dignity. They are in custody, not in a combat zone." I hadn't lost my humanity, even if they had discarded theirs decades ago. I wanted them to see that I wasn't their monster. I was their consequence. Dixon looked at me, a silent respect in his eyes that was worth more than any medal Belinda had ever stolen. The lead agent stood in the center of the grand foyer, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling as he read the warrants. The specific charges of treason, conspiracy to commit murder, and massive fraud related to the Samarand incident were read with a clinical finality. Belinda's face shifted from a defiant red fury to a deathly ashen gray. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The dead daughter she had mocked for her failure was the very person who had personally secured the warrants from the Department of Justice. Belinda's knees didn't just shake, they vanished. She fainted into the arms of the federal marshals, her empire collapsing in a heap of silk and shame. Miley's was sobbing, her QQ facade shattered beyond repair. I walked over to my sister, ignoring the cold stares of the agents. I leaned down and spoke softly. "I cannot stop the law, Miley's, but I've already instructed the trustees to set aside a fund for your basic expenses. Blood doesn't stop being blood, even when it's cold. I did it because I am my father's daughter, and he taught me that mercy is the true mark of strength. The seizure was total. Under the RICO Act, every Thorn defense account, every offshore shell company, and every asset tied to the Samarand blood money was frozen. The Arlington mansion, once a symbol of their untouchable power, was now a federal evidence locker. I walked toward the helipad, the air smelling of ozone and the coming dawn. Dixon caught up to me, his boots clicking on the concrete. I stopped and twisted the Thorn family signet ring off my finger, the heavy gold band that I had worn out of a sense of obligation. "Add this to the seizure, Dixon," I said, dropping the ring into his palm. "I'm not a Thorn anymore. Kenia is just a name now, and that's more than enough for me." He nodded, his hand closing over the gold. We stood there for a moment, watching the amber light of the sun begin to creep over the Arlington horizon. The bridge to my past was finally gone, and I didn't feel the need to look back and watch it burn. I had walked across it, and the ground on this side felt solid for the first time in 5 years. I turned to Belinda one last time as they prepared to lead her to the transport. Her eyes were open now, hollow and staring. "I don't hate you for what you did to me, Mother," I told her, my voice clear and steady. "I pity you for what you did to yourself. I've spent 5 years living in the shadows, waiting for the light. It's time for you to learn what the darkness feels like." She didn't respond. There was nothing left for her to say.